The difference between the mainstream media and the generic alternative community. The mainstream media has an agenda, and that agenda is to control the narrative. In other words, what is printed or what is broadcast on the mainstream media is exactly what you are supposed to believe. I can't remember the last time I read a newspaper article that sort of basically finished off where the journalist said, well, you know, that's what I perceive based on my research to date, but you might want to check this out for yourself, so here's a few websites to go take a look at. It doesn't happen. The journalist is writing the definitive version. What we are trying to do in the alternative community is literally encourage people to take responsibility for their knowledge, for their awareness, and not just regurgitate somebody else's version of events. I would be mortified if I thought that somebody was simply re-quoting me. I mean, if ever I hear somebody say, well, Ian Crane said, I mean, that's not the intention. What I'm trying to do is encourage people to go and take a look at this for themselves. I will never incorporate anything in my presentations that cannot be corroborated. There are occasions when I will say my opinion based on, you know, putting this together is X, Y, Z. But most of the time I'm incorporating stuff into my presentations that perhaps people haven't come across. You know, because I appreciate I have the luxury of being able to research this on a full-time basis. So I'm trying to help people who don't have that time. I'm trying to short-circuit the process for them so that they can literally go maybe straight to something that is of particular interest to them. And so that's the way we must work. It is absolutely critical that people regain every aspect of their personal, independent sovereignty. And that means taking responsibility for every thought and every belief that they have. I am going to talk about the financial issues. Now, we are in a very, very interesting period of Irish history. And there are people, Irish heroes, who have foreseen this, and I'm going to introduce you to one of them at least. And unfortunately, of course, no notice was taken of them. It's a classic case of visionaries are never recognized in their own country. And this particular individual was revered in many other developing nations around the world, but had no recognition in his home country. So we're going to take a look. This is the final meltdown. Ireland is on point. The eyes of the world are on Ireland. And even the banksters have taken notes already and modified their strategy based on the experience of Ireland. And if at the end of my presentation you're not livid, then I haven't done a particularly good job. You need to be really, really angry. You need to get through it, because ultimately we need to do what we do without anger, certainly without fear. But we need a catalyst to actually kickstart change. So we're going to take a look. Who really rules the world? Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the bloodlines, the inner sanctum, etc. I'm going to talk a little generic here. But from the Great Seal, we see in the symbolism here represented the belief system of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. And that's represented by the separated capstone. I mean, I could give a presentation just on this one symbol, but the separated capstone is the most significant part of it. And what this represents is the knowledge and the wisdom retained by the few, those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. And that knowledge and that wisdom never to be shared with the masses being represented here. And if anybody who is regarded as being part of the inner sanctum, or at least being on the periphery of it, if they should transgress their own laws and share that knowledge and the wisdom with the masses, then they tend to, well, let's say, advise them not to travel in light planes. There's been an awareness of this inner sanctum for a long time, not amongst the masses, because the masses really had no access to this information. But we have been provided with the insights of those people who found themselves in positions of power, political leadership. But then they discovered that having got into the senior positions, it really wasn't the political leadership they perceived it to be. In fact, they realized that they were mere puppets of a far greater power. And certainly one of those people was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was President of the United States. He was the president who was effectively persuaded, I use that term very loosely, to initiate the Federal Reserve, to bring the Federal Reserve into existence. And the Federal Reserve came into existence in 1913. Interestingly, and if I have the time, I'll touch on this at the end of the presentation, but very interestingly, the contract between the US government and the Federal Reserve expires at midnight on December the 21st, 2012. And that's a contract that was established in 1913. It was a 100-year contract. But, coincidence? Woodrow Wilson said, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of small groups of dominant men." And certainly one of the major players behind Wilson, not necessarily one of the inner sanctum, but an early 20th century version of Kissinger and Brzezinski, was a guy called Bernard Baruch. And Bernard Baruch left his mark with the Federal Reserve. He left his mark at the Treaty of Versailles. He left his mark with the 1929 crash, which was a manipulated event brought about by the Federal Reserve. He was part of the strategists, the team of strategists that manipulated the American public into supporting US participation in the Second World War, bringing about the events at Pearl Harbor. And again, at the end of the Second World War, when he went on, well, not record, but he was quoted as basically being in a situation where he said, "We need to now put together our strategy that breaks the British Empire and establishes the foundations for true globalization." So Bernard Baruch, ultimately, he died in his 90s, but he handed the reins over to the likes of Kissinger and Brzezinski, and they carry on where he left off. And the tool that these guys have used to establish their control, military is too obvious. But the tool they have used to achieve their objectives by stealth is known as fractional reserve banking. Now, very few people, even though fractional reserve banking is a term that has appeared in the media, more and more over the last few months, but still very few people actually understand how fractional reserve banking works. So I'm going to give you the basic introduction into fractional reserve banking. I mean, this is not the definitive version. It's simply a very simple illustration, and then if you're interested, you can sort of pursue your own line of inquiry down the road. But fractional reserve banking is brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. It is mystical. In fact, it's even more mystical than alchemy. Because with alchemy, apparently, you actually need a base metal to be able to turn it into gold. That's the physical alchemy. But with fractional reserve banking, you actually need nothing. It is literally money from nothing. So I'm going to show you now the fundamental philosophy behind fractional reserve banking, which is to take total control of all material resources on the planet. And it's a very long game. These guys work to a very, very long, multi-generational agenda, because they have a belief system that is so totally alien, and I use that word very loosely here. It's so totally alien to what everybody is taught that basically people would never even take it seriously. And I discussed this in a presentation I recorded about 5 years ago now called The Hidden Agenda. But the way fractional reserve banking works here is we start, let's say, with a central bank. And we'll be generous here. We'll assume the central bank actually has $1 million worth of assets, but it doesn't necessarily need to. But we'll give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's got $1 million worth of assets. Now, on the fractional reserve principle, it will then convert that million on a ledger to 5 million. So we're working on a fractional reserve rate here of 5-1. But the central bank now needs to get that money into the economy. So it does that through, and we'll call these Bank A, Bank B, and Banks, we'll call Bank A and Bank B let's say, regional banks, banks C, D, and E, high street banks. So that 5 million now goes out to the regional banks and down to the high street banks. So each of these banks has 1 million. But this money that's been lent to the regional banks, this 1 million from the 5, so this 1 million, which certainly didn't exist in the first place, but the regional banks are now working to a fractional rate here of 10 to 1. So they've used their 1 million to create 10, and they're going to use their 10 to pump that into the high streets, so they start to pump that money into the high street banks. So what we have here, with the high street banks also working on a fractional reserve basis of 10 to 1, what we have is literally this 1 million, which probably didn't exist in the first place, has now been converted to 10, 20, 40, 60, 90 million pumped into the economy through things like mortgages, business loans, loans to the government. Now, that's all well and good, but the banks actually want some payback from that. But you notice that whilst they've lent the capital, they've unfortunately omitted to lend the interest. So the loan capital has to be repaid, and with interest. And where does the interest come from? The interest comes from the national wealth. And if there isn't sufficient national wealth generated to repay the capital and the interest, then guess what? They lend you more money at interest. And over a period of time, what happens is that with the interest being paid on top of the loan capital, the national wealth of the country gets smaller and smaller and smaller until basically the country has no more national wealth, it has a national debt. And this point here is the point basically of no return. The likelihood of being able to recover from this point here, i.e. where the amount owed is greater than the national wealth, i.e. national wealth in terms of resources and GDP, gross domestic product, is slim to none. And Ireland right now is basically about here. So there is still a possibility of some recovery, but it's slipping away fast. Greece is well down the road here. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Because when a national government reaches the point where it says, well, actually, we don't have the money to repay you, so they say, well, okay, what have you got? What can you sell us instead? And that's when the banks start to take control of national resources. And the most classic illustration of this is this. Recognize this? Yeah. Well, there's a wonderful book called The Economic Hitman by a guy called John Perkins. And John Perkins used to work for the World Bank. And basically, he was employed in his younger days to sell infrastructure projects to developing nations. They didn't necessarily need them, but his job was to convince the leader of a developing nation that they needed to commence massive infrastructure projects because it would enhance their standing and their reputation amongst their people. You know, it would bring them into the developed world. And guess what? We'll lend you the money to do it. Not a problem. We'll lend you the money. Well, John Perkins realized fairly quickly that if he wasn't successful in convincing the national leader to buy into the infrastructure project that he was proposing, then unfortunately that national leader would generally meet with an unfortunate accident, normally in the shape of a helicopter malfunction. Now, so John Perkins in the late 80s, early 90s decided that he could no longer deal with this situation. He could no longer shut himself off from the implications and repercussions of his actions. So he was going to retire, resign, and write a book. But he was very well regarded in the World Bank, so his superiors decided that they didn't really want to put him in the helicopter malfunction situation. So they persuaded him to accept a contract where he effectively received $1 million a year for pretty much doing nothing. He would simply be required to turn up at court cases around the world on the odd occasion, act as a specialist witness, but that was it. But when 9/11 occurred, Perkins said, "This is my line in the sand, and I'm no longer prepared to prostitute myself to global corporatism." So he wrote his book. Well, this is a classic case. I used to live in Dubai. I lived in Dubai from 1990, the end of 1990 until 1993. Developing nation under the Maktoum family, where Sheikh Maktoum was persuaded by the World Bank that he had an opportunity to leave his mark on the planet. And what better way to do it than build these amazing islands off the coast of Dubai, one in the shape of, this series in the shape of a palm tree, another set in the shape of a map of the world. And initially Maktoum said, well, it's a great idea, and yes, I'm a visionary, and yes, I want to leave my mark on the planet, but, this is a little bit of a stretch financially. We're building a balanced economy. We're developing ourselves as a financial centre in the Middle East. We've got the dry docks, we've got the Jebel Ali container port, we've got the aluminium smelting plant, we've got desalination, we've got our golf courses, we've got our tennis courts. We're getting there. And the World Bank said, no, you can accelerate the process. We'll lend you the money. And somewhere along the line, he said, well, okay. So he borrowed the money from the World Bank, developed these amazing islands, and then just as they were about to start selling them to all of those people with way too much money to spend, like footballers and other important people, the plug was pulled on the global economy. And all of a sudden, Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum was left with a massive national debt. And initially the World Bank said, well, not to worry, look, you've got plenty of oil out there. All you've got to do is give us your oil futures, or sell us your oil futures. And then he realized, actually, they were right first time. What they were looking for him to do was effectively hand over the natural resources of Dubai. Now, as it happens, his senior partner in the Emirates, in Zayed in Abu Dhabi, came to the rescue and said, you know what, actually, you don't need to do that. I'll help you out here. So Zayed was effectively, Maktoum was effectively bailed out by Zayed. And the World Bank didn't quite get their clutches on the oil futures of Dubai. But this is a classic illustration of how they work. Of course, in parallel to this, what's going on in the political arena, in terms of globalization, not satisfied with picking up ownership, total ownership, of each of the countries that they go around, they're looking to establish global government through developing these economic communities. It's also been going on elsewhere in the world, with all the other economic groups being established in various stages of their development. And of course, the next primary target, and the legislation's been in place in Canada, the US, and Mexico since October 2005, is to establish the North American Union. The original goal was to merge the North American Union with the European Union by 2015. The new goal is 2022, with global governance absolutely by the latest 2025. But I think they're going to try and accelerate that agenda. So the way they do that is by merging here. That would form the North Atlantic Union, and then bringing all of the other economic unions under the banner of world government. Now, at that time, they would have to change the name of the United Nations, because if you ask the average guy in the US whether the US is part of the United Nations, they would say no. The vast majority of people in the US think the United Nations applies to everybody else and not to them. They still believe that they are sovereign, independent. But of course, they're absolutely not. So here we have the logo, this very aggressive-looking logo. This is the logo of the World Bank. And of course, the World Bank works with its henchman, the World Trade Organization, which has absolutely nothing at all to do with trade. It's about monopoly. In fact, that's what's going on. This is a global game of monopoly. When you're playing Monopoly on the microcosm, the board game, the purpose of the game, of course, is to win by owning everything on the board. Now, I'm told, because I've never done it, but I'm told that if you're the banker, you have an advantage. You might slip yourself the odd few bucks when you need it, when you find your cash funds running low. Well, that's exactly what goes on at this level too. It's called quantitative easing. Just print a little bit more money or add a few more noughts on the computer. And of course, our current EU Commissioner for Trade is, I think, the most absent EU Commissioner of all EU Commissioners. But Baroness Ashton was appointed to EU Commissioner of Trade because she knows nothing about trade. So she is perfectly qualified for that role. She would do as she's told by her bureaucrats. The World Health Organization should, of course, be called the World Sickness Organization. It has nothing at all to do with health. There is no money in health. And the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, but the pharmaceutical industry working hand in glove with the biotech industry by feeding us the GM crap, contribute to, of course, our ill health by giving us food that is basically no better than cardboard. And Big Pharma rides to the rescue. And Big Pharma has a very, very simplistic business model. And that is that every human life form, from the moment of conception to the moment of death, is a potential revenue stream. And the reason that Big Pharma is becoming increasingly aggressive through the Codex Alimentarius agenda, which you're going to hear about from Scott Tipps, who's next up, is because more and more people are actually starting to realize that pharmaceuticals are not exactly in the best interests of their health. So more and more people are turning to natural medicines. The natural medicine market is increasing at a phenomenal rate of knots, despite the best efforts of Big Pharma. And that's why we have a situation coming up in Europe now, where from the 1st of May this year, because the EU is effectively implementing a directive issued through Codex Alimentarius, which works with World Trade, World Health. So many, many natural herbal medicines will no longer be available over the counter from 1st of May this year. They will only be available through prescription. So I'm going to show you in the next slide the mathematical equation as to how the current global meltdown was brought about. And when you see this equation, you will be able to work out for yourself exactly what it is that you need to do to get out of this current situation. There it is. Okay? Got it? Okay, if there is anybody in the audience that can work through this, there's a lot of bankers who would pay you large sums of money to go and quietly explain it to them. Because the reason this equation has led to the disaster we now face is because the senior bankers, many senior bankers, if not all senior bankers, don't really understand it. But it was a classic case that they didn't have the balls to stand up to the young bucks who were driving this. And this equation is the handiwork of a guy called Dr. David Lee, working as an actuarial economist in the US. He came up with this equation, and it's from this equation that many of the bright young visionaries in the financial world came up with these things that are called EFTs, exotic financial transactions. Well, exotic financial transaction is a euphemism for basically saying we have no clue how this works. But we seem to be making a shed load of money from it. So whilst the money's pouring in, we'll just let it continue. Well, there was a very well-informed researcher called Felix Salmon who wrote an article. He actually wrote this article in 2007, actually spelling out, early 2007, spelling out that the attachment of the financial community to this formula, to David Lee's formula, was actually going to lead to a repeat of the 1929 financial crash. But nobody wanted to take any notice. And then 2 years later, Wired magazine actually picked up the article, but that was like printing it, after the damage had already been done. Now, I could spend quite a long time actually sort of working through the detail of the magnitude of the problem within the EU, but I've come across a clip here from an Australian financial program. It's a couple of comedians here. And believe it or not, they both actually have qualifications in economics, but their primary role today is as a comedian. And in this short clip, I think they do a pretty good job of explaining the magnitude of the problem in Europe. And listen very specifically to the number mentioned for the Irish debt.
Your name is Roger, yes? Roger.
Ah, that's your name.
Roger.
Good. And what do you do, Roger?
I'm a financial consultant.
Consultant, eh?
Roger,
yeah,
yes.
Terrific. And Roger, how's business at the moment?
Not bad, thank you. Been a bit quiet lately.
How do you mean lately?
Since the war, been a bit quiet.
Fair enough. OK, Roger, your special subject tonight is the economies of the European community. Your time starts now. Best of luck.
Thank you.
How much does Greece owe, Roger?
$367 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Mostly to the other European economies.
Correct. How much does Ireland owe?
$865 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Other European economies, mostly.
Correct. How much do Spain and Italy owe?
$1 trillion each.
Correct. Who to?
Mainly France, Britain and Germany.
Correct. And how are Germany, France and Britain going, Roger?
Well, they're struggling a bit, aren't they?
Correct. Why?
Because they've lent all these vast amounts of money to other European economies that can't possibly pay them back.
Correct. So what are they going to do?
They're going to have to bail them out.
Correct. Where are they getting the money to do that, Roger?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
How much does Portugal owe?
Hang on a minute. What was the answer to that earlier question?
Just keep answering the questions, Roger. Where is Portugal going to get the money it owes to Germany if Germany can't get back the money that it lent to Italy?
Just a minute. What was the answer to the previous question? The question was, how can broke economies lend money to other broke economies who haven't got any money because they can't pay back the money the broke economy lent to the other broke economy and shouldn't have lent it to them in the first place because the broke economy can't pay it back?
You're wasting very valuable time, Roger. How much money does Spain owe to Italy?
$41 billion, but where are they going to get it?
Correct. What does Italy owe to Spain?
$27 billion, but they haven't got it. They're broke.
Correct. How can they pay each other if neither of them has any money?
They're going to get a bailout, aren't they?
Correct. And where's the money coming from for the bailout?
That's what I'm asking you.
Correct. Why are people selling the European currency and buying the US dollar?
Because the US economy is so much stronger than the European economy.
Correct. Why is that, Roger?
Because it's owned by China.
Correct. And very well done. And after that round, you've lost $1 million.
I've lost $1 million. I thought you said well done.
Yes, well done. You've only lost $1 million. That's an extraordinary performance, Roger.
I've only lost $1 million.
Very well done.
And that's quite good, is it?
Oh, it's excellent.
Sell everything immediately. Quickly.
$865 billion, in case you missed it, was the number for the total Irish debt. Spread right across mainly other European economies. Much of that, if not all of that, was ostensibly private debt, based on bondholders buying up the government bonds. They gambled. They lost. They realized they lost, so they came up with a solution to make sure they hadn't lost, called the bailout. David Rockefeller said, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order." Well, it's a multi-pronged attack, and I don't believe that they've played their last card yet by any stretch of the imagination. But the global financial meltdown is about subjugation. It's about subjugation of nations and subjugations, obviously, of the individuals within those nations. I mean, you're going to hear Scott's presentation on the Codex. Henry Kissinger said, control the food, you control the people. Control the oil, you control nations. Control the money, you control the world. But, as I said earlier, there's an Irish guy who should be part of, and I hope one day becomes part of Irish folklore. Anybody here heard of Raymond Crotty? A few. Well, I'm going to ask a similar question to Jim when he asked how many towers fell on 9/11. How many referendums have the Irish people had on their membership of the EU? You're not sure. How many? 2 or 3? 3. It's three. The reason that you have had 3 referendums on Ireland's membership to the EU is absolutely down to this man. Almost exactly 24 years ago, 24 years ago, Raymond Crotty realised that the railroading of Ireland into the EU, what was then the European Economic Community, through the Single European Act, which was due to be signed into law at the beginning of 1987, Crotty took the Irish government to court and basically made the statement that in the Irish Constitution it was illegal, indeed treasonous, to transfer power from the Irish government to any foreign government without a referendum of the people. In the case that was heard literally, I think it was in the final day of court sitting, in the run-up to Christmas, he actually lost the case and he thought he was bankrupt. But his lawyers, his legal team, recognized that there was some serious omissions and they had some serious misgivings about the judge's summation. And so they immediately lodged an appeal. Well, to cut a long story short, eventually the Supreme Court, it went right through the court, the High Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that Crotty did indeed have a case and that the Constitution did indeed state that the Irish government were not authorised to hand power over to the EU, the European Economic Community. So you had a referendum in '87. Now, in one of Crotty's books, which I don't have with me, unfortunately, but there's two speeches, two short extracts of speeches given by Bertie Ahern. And Bertie Ahern gave a speech in December of 1986. Now, at the time, Bertie Ahern was the leader of the opposition. And he said in that speech that basically there is no way we should be signing the Single European Act into law because it gives away the autonomy and the sovereignty of the Irish people, and it's not in the best interest of the Irish people, and therefore there's absolutely no way this should be signed into law. Well, a few months later, there was an election, and Bertie Ahern came into power. And in a speech that he gave a few weeks after coming into the Taoiseach's chair, he gave another speech saying, we absolutely need to sign the Single European Act into law at the soonest possible opportunity. And he mobilised all forces possible to persuade the people through massive marketing and media campaigns to a yes vote for the Single European Act, which of course was achieved. Now, does this sound familiar? You know, this is like history repeating itself. And as Edmund Burke said, you know, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. So, you know, watch very carefully. Listen to the rhetoric of the politicians in the run-up to the forthcoming elections. Take notes. Today we have the opportunity to at least record those speeches. You know, Bill Hicks used to tell a story in the United States. He said he had this vision that every time a new US president was sworn in on the White House lawn, immediately the ceremony was over, they were whisked down into the basement of the White House, and they were shown the real film of what happened at Dealey Plaza in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. And they let the film sink in, and then they say, now, Mr. President, any questions? Well, you know, I don't know what film Bertie Ahern was shown, or what film Edna Kenny or whoever is going to be shown, but watch for the flip-flop between the rhetoric pre-election and then what they say afterwards. So here's some of Crotty's books, and I've got to tell you, you know, I'm a great believer in synchronicity, and we'll touch on a little bit of that maybe at the end of the presentation. Jim and I had given this presentation, our two presentations, for the first time on October the 22nd last year in the Ashling Hotel, Dublin. And I had done most of my research on Crotty up until that point through papers and, you know, obviously downloads from the internet. But I hadn't actually stepped in and bought the books. I was on the flight going back to Exeter the following day, and the flight wasn't particularly full. And you know, when the flight landed, I was getting my bags out of the overhead locker, and I noticed that the lady sitting adjacent to me was reading a Raymond Crotty book. And I thought, oh my God, because I'd been talking about Raymond Crotty, obviously, in my presentation the night before. Anyway, we had to get on the bus to go to the terminal. And so when we were on the bus, I walked up to her and I said, excuse me, ma'am. I said, I couldn't help but notice that you were reading a Raymond Crotty book. I said, are you familiar with the work of Crotty? And then her husband chipped in and said, well, she should be. This is his daughter, Mary. And they were on the plane to Exeter because Raymond Crotty's grandson, Mary's son, is studying agriculture at Falmouth University in the UK. Now, Raymond Crotty was first and foremost a Kilkenny farmer. And he could see, he was a visionary, he could see the negative impact that membership of the Single European Community, Single European Act, would have on Irish farming. He could see the agenda behind the Common Agricultural Policy. And he spells it out in these books, and I got to tell you that, for whatever the post-Fianna Fáil government is, Crotty's works should be mandatory as study. So the guy was an absolute visionary. But anyway, I first came to Ireland, about 18 months ago or so, to give a couple of talks at the invitation of Ian Crilly, who's behind this event, to talk about the EU and the EU agenda. And this was obviously in the run-up to the second referendum, because you got it wrong the first time. I mean, anybody who thought that the second referendum was going to be staged, on a fair basis is probably delusional. But here was a comment that was made between the referendums. Public opinion will be led to adopt, without knowing it, the proposals that we dare not present to them directly. All the earlier proposals, i.e. those that were in the EU treaty, will be in the new text, but will be hidden and disguised in some way. What was already difficult to understand will become utterly incomprehensible, but the substance has been retained. Pretty much telling it like it is. Those are the words of wisdom of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. What we have in Ireland right now is occupation by stealth. What could never be achieved militarily has effectively been achieved without a shot being fired. And I'm going to show you over the next few minutes that none of this should be any surprise, because part of the belief system of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, part of the belief system is that they have to put the information out there. They have to tell us what they're doing. Because in their belief system, once they've put it out there, once they've told us, once they've given us an insight into their agenda, and if there is no reaction, that is then a mandate. We have effectively given away our power, and then they feel at liberty to pursue their goals. But it is here in Ireland. I mean, I said on Thursday it was the first time I'd actually spoken in an EU colony. So this is the second time. Because Ireland is, to all intents and purposes, an EU colony. And what was so remarkable last night was that the first three guests on the Late Late Show, who were being asked to put forward their prognoses for going forward, they all seem to still believe that Ireland had some control over its destiny. You don't. And you've been told that time and time and time again. I'm not gloating, because the reason the rest of the world, and particularly the other countries in Europe like Portugal, Spain, Italy and Greece and the UK are looking very closely is because this is dominoes. Ireland is the practice ground. Iceland was supposed to be the trial run, but that didn't quite work out. So Ireland is the trial run for the economic subjugation of a nation. Recognize this? Tower of Babylon, yeah. Well, like I said, everything's in plain sight. Because take a look at that. If you haven't seen it before, this is the European Parliament building in Strasbourg. And it is effectively, it is based on this wonderful piece of artwork by Bruegel, the Tower of Babylon. And just in case anybody says, well, it's just pure coincidence, isn't it? Just coincidence. Well, here we go. It's spelled out in words, one syllable. Yeah? Europe, many tongues, one voice. So, I'm not in an EU colony. I'm in a Babylonian colony. And there's a superb book that I want to reference here, Joseph Farrell's book, Babylon's Banksters. Babylon's Banksters. And like I said, it's, we're told what's going on. We're told whose philosophy is being pursued here. Now, I discussed this in much greater detail on some of my previous presentations. What was interesting in the run-up to the second EU referendum, and I must confess, if I hadn't been here and seen it for myself, I would never have believed the magnitude of the marketing campaign, which of course we know was illegal because much of it was funded by the EU. And even under the EU's own constitution, they're not supposed to get involved, not supposed to get involved financially in terms of the internal politics of a member state. But this was critical. This was critical. Poland and the Czech Republic were both holding their breath, hoping that the Irish would return a no vote, because that would give them the opportunity to pull their nations out of the EU. But they knew that basically if the Irish population returned a yes vote, then they'd be suckered in, and it's a whole new ball game. This is from the media in the few weeks running up to the second referendum, the referendum on the Treaty of Lisbon. Here, families struggle to cope with debt surge. No to Lisbon will deepen our economic crisis, experts warn. In the short term, that probably wasn't untrue, but of course what it doesn't say is a yes to Lisbon will mean the end of the Irish nation. Cost of national debt to soar 210 million on no vote, but of course what it didn't say was that the cost of national debt to soar to 860 billion on a yes vote. There we go. Rejection of Lisbon will hit families in the pocket. What it didn't say was acceptance of Lisbon will make sure you got nothing in the pocket. This was the only article I found. This was in the Irish Mail. This is the only article I found in the 7 days running up to the referendum that offered any kind of balance whatsoever. I was making the observation that this is all the politics of fear at its worst. But of course you saw it. Every lamppost, every bus shelter, yes to jobs, yes to investment, until we pull the plug. The next stage of the game, and of course Morgan Kelly spelt this out extremely poignantly some months ago, in fact I think nearly a year ago. Nobody took any notice. But the meltdown in the property market was already occurring. And I mean, if anybody believes that this was not foreseen, that this isn't a deliberate manipulation, once again you're delusional. I recorded a presentation called Fool Me Once in 2007, in July of 2007. I said, we are a matter of weeks, maybe months away from the bursting of the bubble. And I said, I think before the year end, we're going to see banks start to fold, and certainly the property market crashed. Well, 3 weeks after I recorded that presentation, Northern Rock became the first bank to collapse in the EU. Now, remember I said during the fractional reserve that I gave the central bank a fractional reserve rate of 5-1 and the regional banks and the high street banks 10-1. Well, traditional financial practice had been to restrict the fractional reserve ratio to 5-1. But under financial guidelines, the banks could, up until 1998, the banks could, if they wished, have gone to 10-1. It was actually the repeal of an act in the US called the Glass-Steagall Act, which Clinton repealed in his last days as US president, that opened the floodgates here. But when Northern Rock crashed, Northern Rock had a fractional reserve rate of 9-1. 9-1. When Bear Stearns crashed, it had a fractional reserve rate of 27-1. JP Morgan have been in the news recently because their exposure on the silver market has been under much discussion, and there is much debate as to the magnitude of which they have oversold their silver holdings, and it is alleged they've oversold their silver holdings by as much as 100-1, which is why the price of silver has been moving at a fair rate of knots. The next stage of the game is obviously foreclosures. If inflation kicks in, obviously interest rates are going to go up. This should have happened a long time ago, obviously, to prevent the easy access to cash. The property market has been grossly inflated, and with the interest rates about to rise, then obviously many, many people are going to be going into negative equity. Now, what's occurred in Iceland hasn't really received a lot of publicity in the media, because Iceland obviously had exactly this situation, and their property market is collapsing. But they have, first of all, they put a 2-year moratorium on foreclosures. It's just been extended by 5 months. And what they're working on right now is a program which translates as debt forgiveness. It's not really debt forgiveness. It's a very creative program that works on the basis of, as the property market falls, those who took out mortgages, outrageous mortgages, 125% the value of a property, you know, at grossly inflated prices. But those who took out these mis-sold mortgages during the years of the boom, the Icelandic government has said this is the responsibility of the banks, not of the mortgage holder. So what they've said is basically, as the price of property falls, so will the house owner's liability for repayment. So if they borrowed, let's say they borrowed 80% of the value of a property, let's say the value was £1,000,000 kroner, if they borrowed 800,000, they borrowed obviously 80% of the value. As the property falls, they will keep abreast of the current property market, and the liability of the householder will fall in proportion. Now, they're not looking to give anybody an easy ride, because they're saying if the price of property comes back at any stage, then obviously so will the liability of the householder. But what it's doing is it's making sure that people do not lose their homes, they're not thrown out on the streets, they can still make an economic contribution, they're not living in total stress and abject poverty as they desperately try and keep a roof over the heads of their family. But this can only be done when a country actually regains control of its national finances. You know, we saw this in the media just before Christmas. The average house price falls below €200,000. It's got a long, long way to fall. This is not rocket science. The average house has to fall back to a level of, give or take, around about 3 times the average earnings in any given area, so that we get back down to some degree of manageability of personal finances. Of course, the properties aren't worth that anyway, because they're not selling, but it just takes people some time to get their heads around this, particularly the estate agents. Any estate agents in a... I'll bite my tongue. The next stage, of course, is that the currency is being crashed. I mean, we're seeing the dollar fall dramatically at the moment. There's potential that it's going to continue down that spiral. But the euro also. And, of course, Ireland is, unfortunately, inextricably caught up in this. And this is really what, maybe people need to consider doing right now. I mean, for Washington Mutual, replace that with Anglo-Irish or whatever. Because if you have liquidity in cash, it's very high risk right now. So, whenever there's a situation like this, we have to take a look at what people who play the markets are doing. And here's your first clue. That's what gold has been doing over the last 10 years. And let me tell you that the Celtic tiger didn't exist. It didn't exist. It wasn't even a paper tiger. There was no boom. It was smoke and mirrors. The way that you determine whether there is any kind of genuine increase in GDP, it's a note from my mum. Okay, I'll let you know what that says in a little while. Thank you. Very, very timely. What you do to establish whether there is any genuine boom is you need to draw a few graphs. Now, later on during the course of the evening, you'll have a wonderful explanation of how graphs can be manipulated. You don't need to manipulate anything here. You simply draw a line. You look at the increase, alleged, in property prices. You look at the increase, alleged, in terms of the stock market. And then you draw in the value of gold over the same period. If everything else is going up in proportion to the gold, so turn the graph flat so that the gold line is flat. If the other lines are still going in an upward direction, there is some indication there of growth. If the other lines are falling against the gold, then there is no growth. So what was being manipulated here was the created perception that there was a boom, when in reality because the masses are not taught or encouraged to look at the gold markets in any way, shape or form, but you would see very quickly that actually there was no boom whatsoever. So that's what gold has been doing over the last 10 years. So over the 10 years, the return on gold is 416%. 416%. It's close on 30% per annum compound. Over 5 years, the return on gold is 133%. Now, before you rush out and buy gold, you know, gold is a long-term hold. Gold holds its purchasing value. In the 1940s, it was said that one gold coin, a sovereign, will buy you a reasonable quality suit. Today, one gold coin, a sovereign, about £200 at the moment, give or take £190, will buy you a reasonable quality suit from Marks and Spencer's or whatever, but it'll buy you a reasonable quality suit. The gold holds its purchasing value against the inflation, which is caused, of course, by pumping more and more fiat currency into the market. But the markets for the last sort of few weeks have been in turmoil. So this last 60-day period, the gold yield has actually been a negative of 1.7%. So you have to, I'm not a financial advisor, so you don't take anything I say at face value. I wouldn't expect you to take anything I say without investigating it for yourself. But if you want to take a look more at gold, take a look at Kitco, K-I-T-C-O, kitco.com, because this is the gold trade standard, global standard. But I think this is what's happening here is that some people are getting a little nervous. People are saying, well, maybe, and a lot of people have made shed loads of money from holding gold over the last few years, so they're actually cashing in. My own personal opinion, which I certainly wouldn't encourage you to take on board, is that this is, short term, and then we're going to see the trend maybe not continue to increase at the same rate because there isn't going to be the same amount of fiat currency pumped into the system. But I think in the long term, it's going to certainly move in the upward direction. Silver the same. It's very difficult to say how much impact the JP Morgan case is really having, but in theory, silver maybe even has more upside than gold. But gold is a wonderful investment because there's no capital gains tax on gold coins and no VAT. So apart from the commission that you pay on buying and selling, that's it. You know what your deal is. But, here we are in Ireland, and like I said, it's amazing, how events occur, and there's articles in the media which always tend to play a part in my presentations. Because here's your big cheese. But hot news, Brian Cowen has resigned. Shit, I thought you'd be happy. He's resigned as head of Fianna Fáil, but will remain as Taoiseach. And I'm not too sure how that works. Yeah, exactly. Basically, I think what he's saying is, fuck you. If you're gonna jump ship, I don't need any ministers. I can run this alone. So what you have right now is a dictator. He has no government. Now, if he was a benign dictator or a benevolent dictator, I would say that might actually be a step forward. But I'm not sure that Cowen's really cut out for that. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, much of the mythology surrounding, Cowen's sojourns in the pubs around Tullamore. But you know what? I think if I'd have been in his shoes, I'd have been pretty much doing the same. This guy knew that he had not only sold his own soul, he'd sold the soul of the Irish nation. It is not possible. It is not possible for him not to have known what he was doing. It is not possible for him not to have known what was going on in Iceland. But he still continued down the path of effectively selling the Irish nation to the EU, to the IMF. And this is actually from a larger article. And within this article, it's a classic case again. Like I said, they've always got to tell you what's going on. But here it's a classic case. It's around, the paragraphs around about here, so that most people have actually forgotten it by the time they get to the end of the article. But here's the critical point. And this is from last early November. But here is the worst of it. The EU chiefs not only think Ireland's crisis will turn into a national death spiral, they may be secretly hoping it will. Brussels knows that the further Ireland and other troubled Eurozone countries sink into financial disaster, the greater the excuse the Eurocrats can find to achieve one of their long-standing ambitions to take control of national budgets. Yesterday, Olli Rehn, the EU European Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs, said he intended that the punishments, blah, blah, and he goes on to say that basically the punishments that he's looking to implement include removing EU commissioners from nations that are bailed out. So, where's the Irish influence? There isn't any, period. So here again, told in the Irish Daily Mail, this is from October 27th. You can't get more obvious in your face than that. The man who's now running Ireland, Olli Rehn. I don't think this guy's been given an Irish passport yet. He's not elected, he's an EU commissioner. Anybody who believes that the EU is a democracy is unresearched at best. There is nothing democratic about the EU. The European Parliament is nothing more than a talking shop. Now, a trade union representative in a company actually has more influence than an MEP has in Europe. You know, here's a short clip from a sketch based on the Roman Senate. And I think pretty much this reflects what has been going on in the Irish Parliament over the last few weeks.
Oh, fellow members of the Roman Senate, hear me. Shall we continue to build palace after palace for the rich? Or shall we aspire to a more noble purpose and build decent housing for the poor? How does the Senate vote? Fuck the poor! Good.
Which, of course, is exactly what Cowan and Lenihan have done. I mean, austerity does not apply to these guys, period. And Mary Harney, anybody got any idea what Mary Harney is walking away with? €313,000 in her first year out of office. €313,000. And then after that, she has a pension for life of 140,000. Now, 60,000 of that is related to her time. She's been in the Dáil for, I think, 30 years. And so €60,000 would seem a very reasonable pension for her time as a TD. The other 80-odd thousand is based on her 3 years as a minister. You know, so these guys have no clue what they're talking about when they talk about austerity. But they know that. They know that. You know, when I came into Dublin airport, I think it was the beginning of December, I walked down the steps on the way to passport control, and then, you know, it was one of those moments where I realised I'd seen something, and I had to go back and take another look, because there was some sculpture on the roof of Dublin airport which absolutely epitomised for me what was being done to the Irish people. It's like, oh, please don't hit me. Please don't hit me. You know, I haven't got anything left. Total subjugation. And here again, spelled out in words of one syllable, this from, November 10th, I think it was. We are no longer a sovereign nation. We are no longer a sovereign nation. So it's been spelled out for you on the front pages of the newspapers that Olli Rehn is effectively running the country's finances, and statement of fact, Ireland is no longer a sovereign nation, but 40 years of fluoride has worked well. A strategy that has yielded results. You know, Mayor Rothschild said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes its laws." And like I said, here it is. This is from the Irish Independent. Nobody in the political system can argue they weren't warned about the possible extent of the problems facing the country. But, you know, it's one of these classic cases. Sometimes, you know, you have to step back to be able to see what's really going on. And I know that there's so much else going on in Ireland right now that people can't see the wood for the trees. You know, I mean, there's X Factor, Strictly Come Dancing and all, the Late Late Show.
Withdrawal.
Yes, exactly. So there's so much else to keep attention away. But here's a guy, here's an Irishman who unfortunately isn't in Ireland, because if he was, he'd probably be champing at the bit to...
I'm Jason Calabry with the Financial News, and today we're talking to a real Irishman and someone in the money business about what's going on in Ireland with the Celtic Tiger and the banks are hurting so much, the downfall. What's the story here?
Do you really want to know?
I'd love to know.
Well, I'll tell you, it's like what has happened all over the Western world for the last 20 and 30 years. Greed, greed, and more fucking greed, and cheap money. And in Ireland, it's a tragedy what happened to the Tiger. We have, I'd say, 4 causes. We had a stupid fucking government. We had a regulator that was asleep at the wheel. We had very deceitful and conniving and corrupt developers. And of course, above all, wanking fucking bankers. That for the last 20, 30 years are getting these massive bonuses, these employees and directors of banks, on the misfortune of the working class, and getting these huge bonuses and salaries. But, you know, if you and all these arseholes should be thrown in jail and the keys thrown away for the rest of their life. And you know, sir, if you went in and you're unemployed and you wanted to take a loaf of bread out of a store or a supermarket to feed your family, guess what? You'll be up in court for it. These assholes are living all over the world now on the backs of the misfortunate working people. And who's going to pay for all this? We've mortgaged the next generation or two. Who's going to pay for it? The working man. We got the labourer, the small farmer, the fisherman, the nurse, the teacher, the policeman, the fireman, the plumber, the carpenter. Fuck's sake, man, this is a joke.
So I'm sensing a wee bit of discontent.
By the way, let's not be too cocky in this part of the world, North America either. All these debts that people have accumulated over the last 30 years, hey, everybody gets their day in the sunshine.
And you know, speaking of the Celtic Tiger and all that you mentioned, you know that Michael Flatley is really from Chicago, but that's another story.
Fuck off.
Don't you hate it when people hold back and won't tell you what they really think? Wait, you know what? You know what? This is a extract from a news item that was put out on the press channels on Thursday. Iceland's special prosecutor into the banking crisis has confirmed that raids took place on Thursday, 20th of January 2011, and that arrests have been made. The Central Bank of Iceland is among the institutions under investigation. 4 people have so far been arrested in connection with the special prosecutor's investigation into Landsbanki. One of those arrested is John Thornstein, him, former Landsbanki treasury boss. Special prosecutor, him, said house searches are taking place in at least 3 places today as part of investigations into the Central Bank, MP Bank and Straumur Bank. What's going on in Ireland? Nothing. Nothing. Or the UK come for that. I mean, the Barclays chief executive has just picked up 9 million in bonuses. 9 million. Like I said, these guys, they don't live in the same world. They have absolutely no empathy with humanity. These people, their behavior is not human. This greed, this competitiveness is not naturally human. You know, one of the things that I got from working in the oil industry for 20 years, I worked with many, many different nationalities. Many people from different races, different creeds, different belief systems, different philosophies. But you know what? When people have a common goal, it's amazing what they can achieve, and all the differences are set aside, and we focus on what it is we have in common, not what our differences are. What a boring world it would be if everybody agreed. Holy shit. No, we've got to, we learn when we're challenged. That's how we make progress. On the microcosm, we go through personal trauma, personal drama in our lives. And hopefully our life isn't, one long string of drama and trauma. But as we go through each of these cycles, then we have an opportunity to learn. Sure, we get caught up in the drama in the short term. It's inevitable. But even the emotions that we experience are part of the learning process. But the real challenge is to step back and look at what it is that we have perhaps contributed to the process of bringing that drama about. What is it about our thoughts, our words, our actions that maybe brought that drama about? And if we don't learn, then guess what? We're going to do it again and again and again until we do learn. Well, we've got the same situation here in the macrocosm. Tony Blair was on record as saying, actually we don't need to be teaching things like history and geography and, we need to be focusing on some other issues. Well, of course they don't want people to know history because, as Edmund Burke said, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. These guys who are perpetrating this agenda are becoming increasingly arrogant. I received an email from a contact of mine in Brussels, and I talked about this in the last tour of Ireland because I received this email between the two tours that Jim and I did around Ireland last autumn. And this guy said, Ian, you wouldn't believe what's going on in Brussels right now. He said it is obscene. The bureaucrats, and they're not particularly senior, but the bureaucrats are high-fiving each other on the corridors because they believe that Ireland is history. They have achieved everything they set out to achieve in Ireland, and they've established a template. And by the way, they've learned, because what the EU is doing now is tempering the degree to which private debt is passed on to the public, to public ownership. They got away with it in Ireland at the moment, but they know they're probably not going to get away with it in other countries, so they're tempering and saying, well, the bondholders are going to have to take some of the responsibility. Bullshit, the bondholders need to take all of the responsibility. So what I didn't hear last night, except from Jim, unfortunately he didn't have as long as he would have liked, and from the last guest on the show, is that Ireland absolutely needs an opposition like never before. And I'm not talking about a Bernie Ahern opposition that flip-flops. I'm talking about an opposition that is sustained and has a real agenda, which is to return the nation to the people of Ireland. And when I say the nation, I mean everything about the nation, the natural resources. As Jim alluded to, Ireland has more than enough resources to resolve its problems. And in fact, one of the reasons I believe that the grab for Ireland was accelerated was to make sure that the EU had total control, or perceived it has total control of the resources before the people realised exactly the magnitude of those resources. But of course they were pretty much given away to Shell some 20-odd years ago. The Nigerians got a better deal for their natural resources than Ireland has for it. And that's to say nothing of the fishing industry and, of course, the farming industry, which is, as Crotty identified nearly 25 years ago, has been systematically destroyed in Ireland to ensure that the Irish nation is not self-sufficient. And the guys who are perpetrating this agenda have three tools that they rely on to be able to achieve their agenda without any real opposition. Number one is apathy. The apathetic role, keep the people dumbed down, fluoride, GM foods, dumbed down schooling, bullshit on television, chemtrails, GM foods, vaccines, the whole bang. It's a multi-pronged attack. I talk about this in a presentation called The War on Terror, TRRA, the war on Earth. It's the war against humanity. It's a bio-spiritual warfare. The second and most powerful tool that these guys believe they have is abdication. Because by definition, abdication means that we know what's going on, but we deliberately and specifically choose to do nothing. We are effectively giving our soul away to those who believe that they are the rightful rulers of the planet. And if anybody is under any illusion that where this is heading is abject economic slavery. I mean, Huxley, in Brave New World, set his novel in the 26th century. If these guys continue down this path, then pretty much everything that Huxley refers to in Brave New World will be achieved before the end of the 21st century, and maybe even sooner. And the last tool that they have is willful ignorance. You know, now an academic called Dr. John Coleman wrote a book in the 1980s called Committee of 300. And in that book, he makes the observation that those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers acknowledge that 13% of the population will always know what's going on. 13% of the population will have the ability to use discretion and discernment and see through the lies and the deceit and put the pieces of the jigsaw together. And their challenge is to make sure that 13% don't actually get in contact with each other, which in 1986 was certainly much more feasible than it is today, and that 13% doesn't become 14%, 15%, and so on. Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book in 1969, published in 1970, called Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era. And in that book, he said that the future challenge for Western governments will be to keep their people locked into consumerist materialism, preventing them from realizing who they truly are. 40 years ago. On May the 15th last year, at a meeting with the Council on Foreign Relations, Brzezinski made a very similar observation, but this time he said, the major obstacle to establishing one world government is the rapid political awakening of the masses. He ain't wrong. You know, we've got to accelerate that agenda. Now, this is going to be an inevitable result of what's occurring. I mean, we've already seen some of it in Ireland, but let me tell you, weekend protests and weekend riots are nothing. This is exactly what they want. You know, it's, oh, God, let the people let off steam. You know, nobody's in Dublin on the weekend anyway. You know, it gives the police an opportunity for overtime and riot training, especially if we put in our agents provocateurs with black balaclavas wearing their police boots. The food and drinks vendors make money and the transport companies make money. Everybody lets off steam and then they go home. They go home. And then when the politicians go back to the Dáil or into Brussels or whatever, people say, hey, look, you know, we let them let off steam. You know, we give them a release. It's a social release. And then we'll just carry on doing what we're doing anyway because they can't coordinate themselves. Humanity is a slave race. We can manipulate and manage in whatever way, shape, form we want. But there is a way. And the way has perhaps been pioneered in South Korea. Because, you know, this is protest European style. But protest South Korean style can have far more impact. Now, this is from a little under 4 years ago. I think it was 2007. And now I've got to say, I do accept that you have to wait for warmer weather. But that gives you time to get something organised. Because this is what happened on the first day of the protest in South Korea. That's what it looked like at night. That's what it was like the second day at night. The third day at night, and so on. And this for 7 days. And do you know what they were protesting over? The World Trade Organization putting pressure on the South Korean government to import growth hormone contaminated beef. And the South Koreans, which is ostensibly a farming nation, know exactly what that means. They know exactly how that's likely to corrupt their own livestock. and potentially the farming. And they said, no way. So they protested for 7 days. And in the end, the South Korean government went back to the World Trade Organization and said, well done, you've shut down our country. And of course, they came to a resolution. Now, in the EU, at least it was Mandelson, actually. Mandelson, Prince of Darkness, he looked way better with custard all over him. But he actually realized that there was no way, I mean, he did at least have his finger sufficiently on the pulse of the European public to know that there was no way that he could put through the World Trade Organization directive that all WTO member countries should be importing growth hormone contaminated beef. He knew that that would pull people out on the streets in Europe. So, very quietly, the EU agreed and still pays a fine of 150 million euros a year to the World Trade Organization because Europe doesn't import growth hormone contaminated beef. And if you want to see the impact of this drug, which is manufactured by Monsanto, it's called Posilac. So you can see by the name that it was originally developed as a drug to increase the lactation of the dairy cattle, causes phenomenal deformation, discomfort, and more farmers now are refusing to use it, despite the fact they're contracted to Monsanto to use it. But they also realized that actually when you fed this stuff to the beef stock, it bulked them up. You know, so you look at Texas, where beef is the national diet. Why do you think that the average weight of a man in Texas is 350 pounds? You know, this thing doesn't stop just with the cattle. So there is a way. There is a way forward here. And something needs to happen because, I mean, your politicians are once again telling you what's going on. You know, the draconian budget will lead to a lost decade. Lost decade? You know, the abject economic slavery is going to increase. We heard last night of people, you know, already living pretty close to basic subsistence level, and they've lost 350 euros in their monthly income. You think it's going to stop there? You know, these people were talking last night about barely being able to pay the mortgage. Hey, the interest rates haven't gone up yet. And this is the worst situation. Of course, this is actually from a couple of years ago, an incredibly prescient article in Time magazine as to how basically European youth was going to struggle. And here we are in Ireland, and I read last week that 1,000 young people between the ages of 18 and 25 are leaving this country every week. And of course, it's not the people that Ireland can afford to lose. You know, it's the people that Ireland has, the nation, has paid for their education. It's the people that have got skills, transferable skills, like plumbers, electricians, because obviously the building market's dead. Good riddance to the developers. But it's the grassroots level people that are leaving the country. They're going to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia, where they're being welcomed with open arms. And here it is again in words of one syllable. This was a direct quote from Lenihan last year. He said he expected the emigration to exceed 100,000 in 2011. 2,000 a week, on average. But these guys driving this agenda, they want that. They want that. Because the people that will leave are those that potentially have the strength of character to mount a challenge to what's going on within the political arena. Woodrow Wilson again, President of the US at the time of the introduction of the Federal Reserve, he said, some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organised, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. To not acknowledge that this is the situation today is to be self-delusional. You know, is to suffer from the psychological slide, to suffer from the conditioning that your government knows best. And of course, that's exactly what they're trying to break. And that's exactly why we have this multi-pronged attack to dumb down humanity. But as many of you will know, in addition to my work in geopolitics, you know, in parallel, in fact, even before I really started studying the deep geopolitical agenda, you know, one of my interests was on indigenous wisdom, on mythology, on indigenous cultures, and the lost knowledge, the lost wisdom all around the world. In fact, I was in Central America, where I'd been studying Mayan mythology and Mayan cosmology for 6 months when 9/11 occurred. And all around the world, we have information, knowledge, wisdom that is being returned to us in a number of ways, that we're at a very, very significant juncture in the evolutionary process of humanity. Now, this is so widespread, it's way beyond the level of coincidence. Way beyond the level. And last year, in June, I spent some time in Peru. Now, this was a trip that I had planned way back in 2009. And I wanted to spend some time with these people, the Quero, because these are the lost wisdom keepers of the Inca. Now, this group of people had been lost to the world for nearly 500 years. They'd been chased into the high Andes by the conquistadors, and everybody assumed they'd been murdered because the conquistadors returned, but these guys didn't. But they hadn't been killed. They were living at 16,500 feet in the Andes on a diet of potato. And they came out of the Andes in the early 1960s. And the reason they came out of the Andes down to what they call the lower world is because they said they had knowledge, information, insight, prophecy that needed to be shared with the people of the lower world. Now, I'd taken a lot of interest in what the anthropologists had written about these guys and books that other people had written who'd been to visit with them. But I had my own questions, and it's one thing to read it from books, but I wanted to go there and meet with these guys for myself. So I booked this trip. And it was a trip organised by a guy called Alberto Valoldo. And I had this beautiful, beautiful hotel room in Cuzco. The only problem was that it had a sitting area downstairs and then a staircase that went up to a mezzanine floor. And as I got up to go down to the bathroom, because I was feeling pretty sick, I missed my footing, fell down the stairs and broke my ankle. I didn't realise at the time, so I just phoned down to reception, got some ice, packed it in ice, because I was so beat from the trip. But in the morning, it was pretty obvious that it was way more than a sprain. So I went to the hospital, where obviously they gave me X-ray. I had to pay for the X-ray, pay for the plaster of Paris, pay for the doctor to look at it, pay for the doctor to put the plaster of Paris on. Do you know how much that cost me? It's outrageous. Do you know how much? $30. If I'd have been in the US, it would have been $30,000. $30. Then they didn't give me any crutches, though. There's no such thing as the NHS there. So the next day I was hailed a cab because I'd managed to locate a shop that sold medical supplies. And the cab driver said, "Why are you going to the shop?" Fairly obvious, really. "Why are you going to the shop?" I said, "Well, I need some crutches." He said, "Well, my sister has a pair of crutches that she doesn't need anymore." So we went to his house, and so that was my contribution to the local economy. So the next day we were going up to Pisac, which was going to be our base, and where we were going to go up into the mountains and spend some time with these guys. And anyway, obviously that was not going to happen as far as I was concerned. So I said, well, I'm going to jump the coach. I'll walk as far as I can. I'm going to find a nice spot, sit down, and enjoy my own company. Which I did. Beautiful day, beautiful weather, clear blue skies, not a chemtrail in sight, unlike Dublin yesterday. Sitting there for an hour and a half, and I'm just sort of getting to the point where I was almost starting to feel sorry for myself. But I thought, this is really fucked up. Come all this way, cost me an arm and a leg, broken my ankle. Admittedly, I'm sitting in a beautiful spot in the world, but I came here to speak to these guys. How is this going to happen? 5 minutes later, one of these guys comes trundling along the road. Anyway, he came along and he sat down alongside me. I thought, this is a great start. There's only one problem. He didn't speak English, I didn't speak Quero. 20 minutes later, one of his colleagues came along and sat down with him, and they were jabbering away, and every now and again, they look at me, look at the ankle, and make some comments. But, I thought, well, this is amazing. I've got two of them, undivided attention, potentially, but we can't communicate. A few minutes later, a third member of them came along, one of the youngest member of the Quero that we were working with, a lady called Thelma. That's what I called her anyway, close enough. And she could speak good English. So I now had these guys, I had them for the rest of that day. They came, sort me out the following day, and in the end I had to actually suggest to them they needed to go, because I sensed there was a little bit of tension in the group. Because many of these people had obviously, paid their money to come spend the time with these guys. These guys were heading out and come talk to me. That was wonderful. I mean, it was everything I wanted to say. Now, I'm going to paraphrase some of the insights that they shared with me literally in the space of a few minutes. What they said is, I was asking them why it was they came out of the mountains to share their wisdom at this particular juncture. And they said because humanity has to change its way of living. Humanity has to change its relationship with the earth because it's bleeding the earth, it's raping the earth, it's sucking dry the resources of the earth. The earth can provide, but it just can't keep on providing at this rate. So there has to be some behavioural change, otherwise the earth will take measures to make the adjustments. And these guys have a very simplistic lifestyle. They work on the basis that their relationship is with Pachamama, Mother Earth, and that Mother Earth provides them with everything they need, just like every other species on the planet, in fact. And then if they find themselves in a situation of abundance, then they go through ceremony to effectively return to Pachamama the excess that they find themselves with, and that's their gratitude, that's their sign of gratitude for everything being provided to them. And they said, well, I said, why did you come out of the mountains 40 years ago to share this wisdom? Why didn't you just wait there until the earth had dealt with the problem? And they said, because our prophecy is that 90% of the people on the planet must leave unless the behaviours change. And I said, well, why didn't you wait up in the mountains, wait for 90% to leave, and then you could re-inherit the pristine world? And they said, no, you missed the point. It is a prophecy. And after much discussion, I realised that really what they were saying was that, because it's a prophecy, in their understanding of the word, if we know that something is prophesied and we don't want it to happen and we let it happen, then more fool us. The prophecy is an opportunity to do something about it, to make the changes that need to be made. So I said, well, a lot of people are starting to wake up. A lot of people are realising that we cannot live the way we are living, that what we're doing is not sustainable. Even if we can carry on with this lifestyle for whatever years, it's not sustainable in the longer term, and it's not conducive with a healthy planet or a healthy lifestyle. And I said, although people are waking up, it's not happening quick enough. And they said it's going to change very, very quickly. And I said, well, how is that going to happen? And they said, because there is going to be an event which we have known about for many, many generations, which cannot be stopped. And I said, well, what is this event? And they said, solar storms. Solar storms. What they believe, and they share this, and by the way, they are not the only indigenous people in the world who have a very, very similar understanding and comprehension of what's about to occur. The solar storms, go to the NASA website, the solar storms, solar activity at the highest level in recorded history are due to kick in October 2011 and run through until the middle of 2013. And what they say is that the solar storms are going to awaken what we have been told is junk DNA. And it will give us the opportunity to return to who we truly are. And I said, well, will everybody have this opportunity? And they said, yes. But not everybody will take it. Because many people have way too much attachment to their materialistic world. They have way too much attachment to their iPhone, to their computer, to their wallet, to their car, to their handbag, whatever. And they won't take the opportunity. So what these guys are saying is that what's occurring here is going to trigger almost post-humanism. But it's not going to be the post-humanism that those who believe they're the rightful rulers of the planet are trying to establish, which is through control and microchipping. It's going to be post-humanism in terms of our ability to relate to our environment and to relate to each other and move us into a whole new economy that is not consumerist or materialist. Homo luminous. Homo luminous. It's way beyond most people's comprehension. And what they've said is that many people may die, will die, just because what occurs is so far beyond their bounds of perception, they will just not be able to cope with it, and they will effectively die of a coronary. They'll die of fright. 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner said, "He who would create the new must be able to endure the passing of the old in full tranquility." And I'm going to share the final piece of wisdom that these guys shared, because what they said is that, the future world, the post-human world, is still effectively being created. It's being created by us. It's being created by the way in which we are dreaming our future, and eventually we got into the discussion and realised that what we're talking about is visualising. We need to visualise the future that we would like to see without having an existential commitment to it, because we must be prepared to understand that we are extremely limited in our capabilities of perception because of our conditioning. So we have to focus on all the positives that we want to see in that post-human world and let it unfold before us without the attachment. But the other thing that they say we have to do is that's not enough. The other thing we have to do is to get involved. We have to make the contribution in the physical realm. We have to absolutely be a part of the changes that we want to see and that we want to be. So it's a two-pronged element here. We must not sit back and just assume that it's all taken care of. We've got to take responsibility. These guys with their agenda are assuming that they've got us so dumbed down we were not capable of doing that. We've got to take responsibility. We've also got to take the time to find that quiet space, look within, and visualise the future that we want to see. Our future, our children's future, the future of our children's children is in our hands, in our heads, and in our hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.